What's up everyone, Clay here, and I want you to take a moment and imagine with me this situation. You're getting ready for an epic retro game night, and you've got your energy drink, your console is hooked up, and you're ready to go. You grab your favorite game off of the shelf, pop it in, plug in your controller, and you flip the switch. Only to suddenly realize that, oh god, this controller sucks. Personally, I love the N64 and its incredibly unique controller, but companies like Retrobit are aiming to give you a new gaming experience. And actually, using the word new with the Tribute 64 probably isn't the best word, so let's go with updated. Right out of the gate, you'll notice that this controller looks a little different than your typical N64 controller. You've got a bigger stick that sits off to the side rather than smack in the middle since the D-pad was moved there. And overall, the controller is just more compact in terms of button layout. But there is one thing that N64 enthusiasts will immediately notice about the Tribute 64, and that is that it looks dead on like Hori's mini pad that they released exclusively in Japan late in the console's life. And there's a reason for this. In 2018, Retrobit announced that they had signed a deal with Hori to reprint the controller for the Western market under their name, the Tribute 64. Now, for some people, the Hori Pad is considered the gold standard of third-party N64 controllers, and I absolutely agree. I think it is a fantastic controller, so I had to see how the Tribute 64 compares to it. Straight away, it is clear to see that Retrobit wasn't going to cut too many corners when making their controller the modern day reimagining of the Hori Pad. The button placement is nearly identical in every single aspect, and the overall feel is basically spot on. However, Retrobit does make some welcome changes that may be overlooked if you just pick this up without knowing anything about the original. First and probably most noticeable is the start button. Hori used what feels like it was just a little rubber nub, where Retrobit uses that familiar big red button associated with the OG N64 controller. At first glance, you may think this larger button is a big plus. However, I must say that while using both controllers, Hori's feels more organic when gliding from the A and B buttons directly onto that start button. Retrobit moved their start button ever so slightly up to account for the larger size, and that subtle change feels like it throws off what could have been a nice flow. I can't really knock anything from Retrobit here though, because honestly, unless you're sitting down to compare them like I did, this isn't something you'll pay any attention to. And besides, I like the bigger start button anyway. Next up, you may notice that the Tribute 64 has a slightly larger D-pad. In many cases with third-party controllers, the D-pad can make or break the experience for me, and in this case, I think Retrobit delivers. That's definitely not saying the Hori Pad has a bad D-pad. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Both Hori and Retrobit give us exceptional D-pads. And while Hori does tend to feel more substantial, you can't discount the larger form factor of the Tribute. In my experiences with both, I missed fewer inputs with the Tribute 64 than I did with the Hori Pad. I do have to say though that was due mainly to the size and placement rather than the overall quality. In that area, both of these controllers meet expectations of good third-party D-pads, which, basically means that they aren't mushy garbage. Moving to the top of the controller, Retrobit increased the size of all the shoulder buttons. Not only is the Z button larger and more ergonomic, both the L and R buttons got a much needed bump in size. Using the Hori Pad shoulder buttons, for me, was a bit of a bad time. Yeah, I know, thanks. The placement and size mixed with my larger hands made pressing them more of a chore than a natural motion during gameplay. On the flip side, the Tribute 64 has its L and R buttons both longer and wider, coupled with the much larger Z buttons that, like I mentioned earlier, are a bit more ergonomic and curved to fit your finger. All in all, that just adds up to a better experience on the Tribute over the Hori Pad. So now we get to talk about everybody's favorite thing in the world, that analog stick. Of course, at first glance, they look incredibly similar, and you would never notice this unless you're making a video comparing the two, but honestly, who would do that? Whew. Water time. It's a similar comparison to the D-pad where they both feel good, but there's just something about the stick that Hori included that, again, feels more substantial than what Retrobit produced. It seems just a little snappier and more responsive, though in-game, they both performed perfectly fine. Okay, so now we can talk about the biggest difference for me, and that is the overall size of the controllers. And to be completely honest, neither of these controllers are big. They're both rather small, but the Tribute 64 is slightly larger, and that makes a huge difference in usability for me personally with my larger hands. So that might be something that you want to look at too if your hands are kind of big like mine. Now, all of these initial comparisons are all well and good, but the question is, how does this thing perform when you're trying to play games with it? And in order to find out, you guessed it, I played games with it. Playing with the Tribute 64 at first feels a little bit odd, honestly, especially when you're used to the original N64 controller. However, to my surprise, I got used to it rather quickly. Other than the analog stick and the D-pad being swapped, the biggest difference for me was getting used to having more than one Z trigger, and those triggers being up on top as your second shoulder buttons. Unlike the original stick, this one feels like it may stand the test of time a little bit longer. However, through my nostalgia-tinted glasses, nothing really compares to the feel of that hard plastic nub digging its way into your hand during Mario Party. Button presses are responsive and solid. There really is no mush with the Tribute 64. One thing I noticed when plugging this into the console was that it is an incredibly tight fit. I will say that this isn't an issue that is just isolated to the Tribute, as I've had this same tight fitting problem with other controllers as well, like the Brawler 64. Overall, the Tribute 64 shows that it was made for people looking to get that Hori Pad feel, but for a fraction of the cost. The controller as a whole doesn't feel overly cheap. The face buttons seem to be made of high quality plastics and the shell appears to be ready for a beating. All of this together really makes that analog stick feel out of place. Like I said, it's not terrible, it just doesn't quite feel right when you consider how well made everything else appears to be. While the Tribute 64 can handle your memory cards and your rumble packs, if you hope to play Pokemon Stadium or any other game that uses the transfer pack, like Mario Tennis for example, you better be prepared to pick up an authentic controller, as the Tribute does not support them. However, again, this is not just an issue with Retrobit, but most third-party controllers. It's not a deal breaker because there are workarounds like plugging a second controller in that is the authentic one and using the transfer pack from that with your first player controller, but really that's kind of annoying. I wish they would have a way to get this to work, but I guess the technology is just not there at this point, or it's a little bit convoluted to try to figure it out. So that is a look at the Tribute 64 from Retrobit. All in all, the Hori Pad feels like the better made controller with higher quality parts. But on a budget, the Tribute 64 is going to be just fine. Personally, the larger size of the Tribute 64 had me picking it up to play with it more often than reaching for the Hori Pad. Keep in mind though that if you do have larger hands, both of these controllers are on the small side, with the Tribute 64 slightly edging out the Hori Pad. Let me know below underneath that like button whether you're using the Tribute 64, the Hori Pad Mini, or any of the other newer third-party solutions for N64 controllers. And hey, maybe you're like me and you actually enjoy the original N64 controller. But no matter how you play your N64 games, until next time, take care everyone.